You know what time it is? Woo! Okay, let's start over because I got a little too excited and threw the mic. Okay. You know what time it is. Woo! Get into it! Get into it! Yes! Okay, one of these days I'm gonna end up hurting myself from tossing the book up in the air. Hi! Welcome back with Storytime with Chris. Hold on. I gotta go pick up my tiara. Hold on one second. Yes. This was awesome. There we go. Alrighty. Yes. Killing the game in this orange. Orangey. The Japanese word for orange. Orange. French. I used to know the Spanish for orange, and I cannot think of the name right now. And I feel bad that I forgot just like that. It'll come to me in a second. Hi, y'all. Welcome to Storytime with Chris. You know, you don't have to watch these videos when they go live. You're more than welcome to watch them in your downtime, nap time, max, relax, and chillax time, in between time, mean time, study time, break time, CP time. Any time that you want to hear a highly animated voice bring you wonderful stories of magic, fantasy, science fiction, adventure, and many, many more in between. Hi. What's going on? Oh, yes. I'm in Ohio. It was 70 degrees on Monday. And it's Wednesday, and it's dropped back down to 47 degrees. Stay safe out there, y'all. Mother Nature is on her own schedule, okay? She said, let them have all 4 seasons in one day. Let's just let them have it. But that's not going to stop me from having a good time. We're back with Alexander's The High King, which, by the way, if you are not aware, with the exception of yesterday, with the new episode of the first chapter of The Vile Village of a series of unfortunate events on Instagram, all of the new episodes of Storytime are now on YouTube. So if you haven't done so already, please go check that out. And if you're not connected with... Sorry, I'm trying to find my place. If you are not yet subscribed to the YouTube channel, you should do so. It's in my bio. The link is within my Facebook as well as my Instagram bio. Please show us some love. There we go. Okay, now we cook it with grease. Been saying that a lot lately. Now we cook it with grease. Anybody that knows me at work knows I've said that quite frequently, especially when I'm trying to fix something. But yes, if anybody notices, this is Aquaman symbol. I'm a huge Aquaman fan. Comic book wise, I would say that Aquaman tied with Superman and Batman are my favorite comic book characters of all time. Aquaman stories are very much slept on, y'all. Come on now. Like, Aquaman has some really good stories, especially the ones from the last 5 years. And for my DC comic book fans, if you know, you know. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, okay? And no, I don't own the music that you're listening to in the background, which is brought to you by Melancholy Music, TPR. Go check them out. Yes. There we go. Chapter 14. The Princess Ailan was doubly angry. First, she was lost. Second, she was a prisoner, swept away from Tarn and Fluter during the attack. She would surely have fallen among the slain had not Gurgi dragged her from the fray. When the assault had shifted behind them, she had stumbled blindly with Gurgi at her side over the darkening crags. At nightfall, when they could search no longer for Tarn, Gurgi had found a shallow cave where they crouched and shivered until first light. During the next day, as the two companions sought Tarn's trail, the marauders had suddenly leaped upon them. Biting, kicking, and scratching, Ailanwe struggled vainly to free herself from the burly man who had seized her. Another had flung Gurgi to the ground, and with dagger drawn set his knee in the small of the hapless creature's back. In a trice, the two companions were bound hand and foot and hoisted like meal sacks on their assailants' shoulders. Ilanwe had no idea of the direction in which was being carried, but in a little while she glimpsed a campfire flickering through the gathering dusk, and hunched around a ruffianly band of a dozen or more. The man squatting nearest the fire looked up, garbed in dirty sheepskins and a rough cloak. He was heavy-faced and stubble-bearded, his long hair yellowish and tangled. "I sent you for game, not prisoners," he called out hoarsely. "What have you found?" "Lean pickings," answered Ilanwe's captor, dropping his furious burden to the turf beside Gurgi. "A brace of curls for what they may be worth." "Nothing, very likely." The heavy-faced man spat in the fire. "You should have slit their gullets and spared yourself the burden." He climbed to his feet and strode to the companions. With a grimy, broken-nailed hand, he seized Ilanwe by the throat as if he meant to throttle her. "Who are you, boy?" he demanded in a grating voice, his cold blue eyes narrowed. "Who do you serve? What ransom will you bring? Answer quickly when Dorath asks a question." Y'all heard that name. So for anybody that's been following the previous books prior to this, Dorath is a villain from the previous book. At the sound of the name, Ilanwe caught her breath. Taran had spoken of Dorath. From Gurgi's terrified whimpering, she judged he too had recognized the outlaw. "Answer!" Dorath cried with a curse. He struck Ilanwe across the face. The girl stumbled and fell, her head singing from the blow. The golden sphere dropped from her jacket. Ilanwe strained at her bonds and tried to fling herself on top of the bauble. A booted foot kicked it from her. Dorath bent and snatched up the spear, turned it curiously in the firelight. "What is it?" questioned one of the ruffians, pressing closer to gape at the bauble. "Gold it is," said another. "Come, Dorath, chop the thing apart and share it out." "Hands off, you swine!" Dorath growled. He thrust the bauble into a sheepskin. Mutters of protest rose from the band, but Dorath silenced them with a glance. He bent down to Ilanwe. "Where did you steal such a trinket, you young thief? Will you keep your head on your shoulders? Then tell me where we can find more treasure like this." Excuse me. Ilanwe, though furious, kept silent. Dorath grinned. "You will speak soon enough," he said, "and only wish you had spoken earlier. First, let me see if your fellow has a tongue looser than yours." Gurgi, teeth chattering violently, had sunk his head deep into his sheepskin coat and tightly hunched his shoulders. "Do you play turtle with me?" Dorath cried with a harsh laugh. He knotted his thick fingers in Gurgi's hair and jerked the creature's head upright. "Small wonder you hide your face. It's as ugly as ever I've seen." Dorath stopped suddenly and squinted closer. "Ugly it is, and not one easily forgotten. So ho, we are old friends, you and I. You share my hospitality once more. When last we met, you were comrade to a pig-keeper." He turned his glance on Ilanwe. "But this is not the swineherd." Dorath gripped Ilanwe's face and roughly turned it from side to side. "This beardless boy?" He grunted in surprise. "What then, boy? No boy at all, a wench." Which, first of all, it's an old term. It's not okay to call a girl a wench. Okay, you call somebody a wench, get your cottage burned down. Okay, back then. Okay, you don't call nobody a wench. It's rude. Excuse me, I need tissue real quick. I'll be right back, y'all. Don't be calling nobody no wench. Ilanwe could no longer contain herself. "Wench,
indeed. I'm Ilanwe, daughter of Ankara, daughter of Regent Princess of Lear. I don't like being tied up. I don't like being smacked. I don't like being pawed. And I'll thank you for stop doing all of that immediately.
Despite her bonds, she kicked vigorously at the outlaw. Dorath laughed and drew back a pace. My memory is that the Lord Swineherd spoke once of you. He gave a mocking bow. Welcome, Princess Vixen. You are a choicier prize than any ransom. A long score lies between Dorath and your pickkeeper. You give me and my company the pleasure of settling a little of it.
I'll give you the pleasure of setting Gurgi and me loose this very instant.
Ilanwe flung at him.
And I shall have my bauble again.
Dorath's face had grown molted. You shall go free, he said between his teeth, after a time, my pretty princess. After a time, when you shall be fitting company for pigkeepers. Perhaps you may join the swineherd again. Perhaps you even recognize your charms, whatever may be left of them.
Have you ever considered what will be left of you when Taran finds you?
Ilanwe retorted. Until now, the Princess of Lear had kept her self-possession, but she could sense the outlaw's thoughts behind his cold eyes, and for the first time, she was deeply afraid. Lord Swineherd and I will finish our reckoning when the time comes, Dorath replied, grinning. He bent toward her. But your time is now. Gurgi thrashed wildly in his bonds.
Do not harm wise and kindly princess, he shouted. Oh, Gurgi will make you pay for hurtful wickedness.
He flung himself against Dorath and tried to sink his teeth into the outlaw's leg. Cursing, Dorath turned on Gurgi and snatched out his sword. Ilanwe cried aloud. But before the outlaw could begin his downward stroke, a long shape sprang suddenly from the overhanging rocks. Dorath gave a stifled shout. His weapon fell from his hands, and he toppled backward, the furry shadow snarling and tearing at his throat. At the campfire, the other outlaws leaped to their feet and screamed in terror. Gray shadows were all about, closing swiftly on them. Vainly the marauders sought to flee, but on all sides they were flung back, borne to the ground by the force of lean bodies and slashing fangs. Gurgi began yelling fearfully,
Help, oh help, all evil spirits come to slay us all!
Ilanwe forced herself upright. Behind her she could feel something sharp gnawing and worrying at her bonds. In another moment her hands were free. She stumbled forward while the gray shadow tore away the thongs holding her feet. In front of her lay the motionless body of Dorath. Quickly Ilanwe knelt and drew the bauble from the outlaw's sheepskin jacket. From her cupped hand the sphere shed golden rays on a huge wolf crouching before her. By the campfire she glimpsed other wolves withdrawing as swiftly as they had come. Behind them all was silent. Ilanwe shuddered and looked away. The wolves had done their work well. Gurgi had been freed by a gray she-wolf with a white blaze on her breast, and pleased that he was to be out of the warrior's clutches, he wrinkled his forehead and cast a distrustful glance at his rescuer. The wolf, Briavale, blinked her yellow eyes and grinned at Gurgi. Gurgi, nevertheless, chose to keep his distance. For her own part, Ilanwe surprisingly felt no fear or uneasiness. The wolf Branach sat on his haunches, watching her closely. Ilanwe put her hand on the animal's shaggy, muscular neck.
I hope you know we're trying to thank you, she said, though I'm not sure whether you understand or not. The only wolves I've ever met personally live far from here in Midwind's Valley.
At this, Branach whined and wagged his tail.
Well, you do understand, said
Ilanwe.
Midwind,
she hesitated.
There were 2 wolves.
She clapped her hands.
It must be. I don't mean to say I can tell one wolf from another, at least not at first glance, but there's something about you that reminds me... Oh, in any case, if that's who you are, we're very glad to see you again. We're obliged to you, and now we'll be on our way, though I'm not exactly sure which way our way is, if you see what I mean.
Branach grinned and showed no sign of leaving. Instead, he remained on his haunches, opened his jaws, and gave a high-pitched bark. Ilanwe sighed and shook her head.
We're lost in trying to find our companions, but I haven't any idea how to say assistant pigkeeper in wolf speech.
Gurgi, meantime, had picked up his wallet of food and slung it over his shoulder. At last, seeing the wolves meant him no harm, he drew a little closer to Brannock and Briavale, and looked at them with great interest while they studied him no less curiously. Eilonwy turned to Gurgi.
I'm sure they're willing to help us. Oh, if I could only understand them. What good is it being half an enchantress if you can't even tell what a wolf is trying to say to you?
Fair point, well made. Eilonwy stopped short.
But I think I did understand. I must have. There, one of them just said, tell us. I could hear. No, not hear. I could feel it.
She looked at Gurgi in amazement.
It's not words at all. It's like listening without your ears or hearing with your heart. I know it, but I can't imagine how I do. And yet,
she added wonderingly,
that's what Taliesin told me.
Oh, great wisdom, Gurgi cried. Oh, clever listenings. Gurgi listens too, but inside hears only rumblings and grumblings when his poor belly is empty. Oh, sorrow, Gurgi would never hear deep secret things like Princess.
Eilonwy dropped to her knees beside Brannock. Hurriedly she spoke of Tar and of all the companions and what had befallen them. Brannock perked up his ears and barked sharply. The huge wolf rose from his haunches, shook the snow from his shaggy coat, and with his teeth gently plucked at Eilonwy's sleeve.
He says we're to follow them,
Eilonwy told Gurgi.
Come, we're in safe hands now. Or, should I say, paws. Oh, darling.
The wolves padded silently and swiftly, following hidden trails and passages whose existence the girl would have never guessed. The two companions strove to keep up with Brannock's rapid pace, yet often, despite themselves, they were forced to halt and rest. At those times, the wolves seemed satisfied to wait patiently until companions were ready to journey once again. Brannock crouched at Eilonwy's side, his gray head between his paws, seldom drowsing, his ears alerting and moving at every faint sound. Briavale, too, served as sentinel and guard, springing lightly to the rocky peak, sniffing the air, then, with a gesture of her head, beckoning the companions to follow. Which, by the way, sentinel is one of my favorite words. A sentinel is a fancy way of saying a guard, or a shield, a watchman. Reminds me of the Princess and the Goblin. Guard! Double the guard! The sentinels! Yes. Which, The Princess and the Goblin is a story that we will read. It is a very, very old fairy tale, but it comes with a sequel. We're going to read it, okay? We're going to read it. Probably around my birthday time. I feel like that's appropriate. There we go. Of the rest of the pack, Eilonwy saw little. Now and then, however, she would awaken from a brief slumber to find the wolves sitting in a protective circle about her. Soon the lean gray animals would vanish into the shadows, while Brannock and Briavale alone remained. The girl surely became aware the wolves were not the only creatures in the hills of Bran Galid. Once she glimpsed a large company of bears lumbering in single file along a ridge. They halted a moment, peered curiously, then resumed their march. In the cold, clear air she heard the barking of foxes in the distance and other sounds which might have been echoes or answers to some unknown signal.
They're scouting all through the hills,
Eilonwy whispered to Gurgi, pointing to a bare summit where a tall stag had suddenly appeared.
I wonder how many other bands of outlaws were roaming around. The bears and wolves have anything to say about it. I somehow don't think there's very many.
The wolf Brannock glanced at her as though he had overheard Eilonwy's words. He lolled out his tongue and blinked his yellow eyes, and around the sharp rows of gleaming teeth his lips turned slightly in an unmistakable smile. They continued on their path. At nightfall, Eilonwy lit her bauble and held it aloft. The full wolf pack she saw had joined them once again, moving in long files on either side of her, just beyond the circle of golden light. The bears, too, were following, and other forest creatures whose presence she sensed rather than saw. There were in the hills of Bran Galid many places of danger and death. Of these the Princess of Lyr was unaware, for she and Gurgi passed them by unharmed, safe amid the watchful band of silent guardians. Late in the morning of the next day, Briaviel, who had spent most of her time scouting the passages, grew excited and eager. The she-wolf barked and leapt atop high-standing rocks where she faced westward, wagging her tail briskly and urging the companions to greater speed.
I think they found Taran, Ilanwe cried. I can't quite make out what they're saying, but it sounds very much as if they have. Men and horses, a mountain cat, that must be Lion. What are they all doing in this direction? Aren't they going to the Red Fallows again?
Neither Ilanwe nor Gergi could check their impatience to join the companions once more. They refused to halt for food or rest, and Brannock frequently had to fasten his teeth in Ilanwe's cloak to keep the girl from taking needless risks among the ever-steeping hills. Soon the travelers reached the rim of a deep mountain cup, and a cry of joy burst from Ilanwe's lips.
I see them! I see them!
She hastily pointed downward to the wide valley. Gergi had run up beside her and began to leap with excitement.
Oh, it is a kindly
Master, he shouted. Oh, yes, and brave bard! No bigger than ants, but sharp-eyed Gergi sees them. Oh.
Only by straining her eyes could Ilanwe distinguish the tiny figures, so distant were they. The long descent into the valley she knew would take the rest of the day. She was as anxious to reach the companions before nightfall. She was about to scramble down the cliff when she stopped suddenly.
What can they be doing? She cried. They're going straight into the wall of rock. Is it a cave? Look, there's the last horseman. Now I can't see any of them. If it's a cave, it must be the biggest one in Prydain. I don't understand a bit of it. Is there a passage of some kind? Or a tunnel? Oh, that's so vexing. You might know an assistant peakeeper would take it into his head to vanish the moment he's been found.
Hurriedly, Ilanwe began picking her way down the steep slope. For all her haste, the descent seemed endless. Even with the help of Brannock and Briavel, the two had gone little more than half the distance by the time the sun had dropped westward and the shadows had begun to lengthen. Brannock suddenly halted and growled deeply in his throat. His hackles rose and he bared his teeth. The eyes of the wolf were fixed in the valley, and his muzzle twitched uneasily. In another moment, Ilanwe saw what had made Brannock stop. A long column of warriors had appeared and was moving rapidly westward. Briavel whined shrilly. From the voice of the she-wolf, Ilanwe sensed fear and hatred. She understood the reason.
Huntsmen!
The girl cried.
It looks like hundreds of them on their way back to Anilfin. Oh, I hope they don't see Taran's tracks, though he's very likely safe enough where he is.
No sooner had she said this than a movement at the distant wall of rock made her clap a hand to her mouth. From the deepening shadows she saw one by one the tiny figures of Taran and his band reappear.
No!
Ilanwe gasped.
They're coming out again!
From her vantage point, the girl could scan the valley, and it was suddenly coldly clear to her that the Kamot warriors and the husband, as yet unseen by one another, were moving closer together.
They'll be trapped!
Ilanwe called.
Taran! Taran!
The echoes died in the vast snowy expanse. Taran could neither see nor hear her. Darkness had now fallen over the valley, blinding the girl to the inevitable clash of the warrior bands. It was a nightmare in which all action was useless, in which all she could only wait for the slaughter bound to come. She felt as though her hands were tied and her voice stifled. Still calling Taran's name, Ilanwe snatched the bauble from her cloak. She lifted the sphere high. The brighter and brighter it glowed. The wolves turned away fearfully, and Gergi threw his arms over his face. The beams spread and rose toward the clouds, as though the sun itself were bursting through the mountainside. The dark cliffs and black branches of the trees were drenched in light, brilliant and clear. The whole valley had turned bright as noon. And that is where we're going to end for tonight. In the words of Marnie's grandmother from Halloween Town, honey, darling, being normal is vastly overrated. Okay? Now, if you remember when we read The Castle of Lear, which is the third book in the series, even though the Book of Lear was destroyed, Ilanwe still has latent meaning hidden magical powers that could be of a benefit to her friends. And she needed to warn them. So when you... This is why I love stories like this. Even when the situation seems tough and hopeless, don't give up. Keep believing. And the representation of her belief is in the form of her gold. The golden peladrin is the proper name, but she calls it her bauble. So she was able to use it to brighten the area, brighten the day, from night to day. So hopefully we'll see what happens next. Hopefully her efforts are not in vain. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye, y'all.